Welcome back. Again, we're here with Rich Condon, probably about 400 to 500 yards distance from where we just had our last segment. And of course, behind me is the famed little round top. And Rich is then going to orient us on the landscape here and continue to talk about the story of the Pennsylvania Reserves on July 2nd.
All right, so right now we're actually standing more toward the southern end of the famed wheat field. Behind us, you can kind of see, but not really, there's a stone wall that's out in the brush here. And then way back there, you have the lower slope of Little Round Top. And it's actually at that point that the Pennsylvania Reserves are going to form up before they attack down through Plum Run Valley and in this direction. Samuel Crawford, commander of the Pennsylvania Reserve Corps, is going to form up one brigade led by William McCandless up on that ridge. You're going to have the 1st Pennsylvania Reserves, 11th Pennsylvania Reserves, and the 6th Pennsylvania Reserves in the front rank, and in the rear you're going to have the 2nd and 13th Pennsylvania Reserves, or also known as the Bucktails. So as Federal troops are being pushed back through the wheat field and through the woods right here toward Little Round Top, Confederates are just rolling them up. Confederates are shooting into the backs of the U.S. regulars that are approaching the Pennsylvania Reserves on that lower slope of Little Round Top. Samuel Crawford is going to grab the colors of the 1st Pennsylvania Reserves, and he says, "Reserves forward." And the reserves start to charge down that slope in our direction and basically sweeping up Confederates as they move along, and they're going to make it to this stone wall out here in this brush. William McCandless realizes that the Confederate line extends beyond his own, so he's going to take that rear rank, the 13th Pennsylvania Reserve Bucktails and the 2nd Pennsylvania Reserves, and he fans them out in that direction, down toward Devil's Den. The 2nd Pennsylvania Reserves and the 13th Pennsylvania Reserves check the Confederates on that end of the line. And it's actually during that fighting that Charles Taylor, the commander of the 13th Pennsylvania Reserves, is going to be killed, shot through the heart, actually. During this attack, Crawford says later on in his memoirs, "These men are moving down into the valley, and there's a terrific shout which exceeded anything I ever heard as they dashed upon the rebel hosts and drove them back." Evan Woodward of the 2nd Pennsylvania Reserves, who's sent down in that direction, says of the action, "With a simultaneous shriek from every throat that sounded as if 1,000 demons who had just burst their lungs uttering it. On swept the reserves, delivering, as started, a solid volley and careering victoriously the field, halted not a moment until they reached a stone wall, right here, bordering on the skirting of woods. The surprised enemy made their last desperate rally to retrieve the day." So the Confederates are pushed back in that direction. The Pennsylvania Reserves kind of push out into the wheat field, but ultimately they're going to settle here at this stone wall, and this is where they're going to be for the remainder of July 2nd, 1863.
Now, is this quite late in the day on the 2nd, Rich?
This is very late in the day. Okay. Longstreet starts his assault at 4 o'clock. These guys are being thrown into action after all the, I guess you could say, confusing maelstrom that happens here in the wheat field.
Okay.
They're almost like the last-ditch effort to plug up the gap on this section of the Union line.
Okay.
And so the Pennsylvania Reserves are here until July 3rd, when at 3 o'clock the next day they'll see action again.
Yeah.
We all know at this point the famous Picketts Charge was happening not too far from here. But the Pennsylvania Reserves are going to be called upon at about 3 o'clock that day to basically sweep up the rest of the Confederates in this area. And ultimately the 13th Pennsylvania Reserves Bucktails are going to push in toward Devil's Den. There's some Confederates in there, the 15th Georgia. They capture all of them and also their battle flag. But ultimately, after a short stout of fighting, this area is clear of the Confederate enemy.
But probably kind of a, it's not even a side note, but this is a component of the fight on the 3rd that we often don't think about. It's found, of course, in serious studies of the war, but not often talked about, at least among public audiences.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's an interesting piece of ground that is engaged on the 2nd and the 3rd, and again, something that we don't often consider.
And a lot of the Confederates here are quite demoralized and exhausted as it is, so when the Pennsylvania Reserves come from behind their cover, they just kind of give way fairly easily, and they take very little casualties.
Okay.
The Pennsylvania Reserves overall are going to take 210 casualties in this action.
Okay. And from this point on, what's their service record in the rest of the war?
Pennsylvania Reserves are going to go on and serve through the Mine Run campaign. They see really heavy action toward Spotsylvania in the wilderness, and ultimately they're going to be disbanded in June of 1864.
Oh.
A lot of these guys go on to serve in the 190th Pennsylvania Infantry.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Rich. We deeply
Thanks
appreciate
for having
it.
me.
Again, Rich Condon, currently a ranger at Flight 93, and one of the voices behind Civil War Pittsburgh and their new endeavor, Civil War Pennsylvania.
Pennsylvania and the Civil War.
Pennsylvania
That's correct,
Civil War. So I'd encourage you all to find Rich on the web and to look at the really good material that he and Jake and others are producing. So thank you all so much.
Thanks for having me.
And thanks for tuning in. We have one last segment today on the 1st Minnesota in about 30 minutes time, and we will see you then. So thank you.